Hi everyone, it's Dan. I've got another short take here from a question that a friend asked me over the weekend that I'm going to take a swing at. I don't know if this is going to work. This is a little bit of a tough one. Dear friend of mine writes to me and sends me this thing about polarization. Says, "Is this something you're interested in? Is this something you're working on?" And just waited for a day thinking about it, chatted about some other stuff, and sent her back something that I'm not super satisfied with. So I'm going to try to just rant about it and see if I can get something better out here. The basic issue with polarization, and this has been on my mind because we just did a focus group 2 weeks ago. We're going to have sound on the podcast at some point from this focus group. There was a lot in it. We had some question. We had a question in there that I'm not crazy about the way that we framed the question, but we sort of asked people, like, do you want bipartisanship or do you want Dems that would fight, right? And there were a lot of people who said they want bipartisanship. And what's going on with this is that people don't really have a strong narrative of why everything feels so broken in this country right now. And part of that, the biggest gap in that, is because Democrats have not told them a story about what's going on. So in place of that, they've come up with like other sort of folk theories about what's going on. And one of them is like just like the lack of bipartisanship, right? We hear this all the time from both parties. You know, even Republicans still talk about it sometimes, even though their whole strategy has been to not do any bipartisanship at all and just constantly talk down the Republicans. Every once in a while you hear it anyway. Democrats talk about it all the time. Just today, Hakeem Jeffries was saying he wants bipartisan action on housing or something. I forget what he was talking about. And on the one hand, so like we did this focus group, and then I asked on my Facebook page, I asked my friends, I was like, how do you feel about this? Because I was curious, and sometimes it's helpful just to like have conversations and pull things apart. And there were all these questions, or like all these people were like, because we'd heard like both parties are the same, or like, you know, there's no difference between the two, right? And on some level, like that's like a wild thing to be saying right now, like with like the Republican, like Trump Republican Party, like invading cities and like dragging people out of their houses and like breaking car windows and seizing Americans and anybody who they think is an immigrant, or, you know, drawing up plans to turn Gaza into a shopping mall. Like there's like, obviously there's a huge difference, and yet people still sort of have this idea that like they're both the same. So like out of like, I don't know, a couple dozen of my friends chimed in on this. And there was one person who was like, wait, that's a crazy thing to say and to think, right? The parties are really different. But because we've sort of gotten used to this, and because there haven't been really any Democrats saying, no, there's this other thing that's going on that's the problem, that story isn't in any of our brains. So given that there's a gap there, the thing that people have filled in is sort of, you know, well, it must be the lack of bipartisanship. It must, you know, we're too polarized, right? We hear this constantly, right? Where everything's polarized. That's the problem, right? So what I told my friend who texted about this was, I was like, look, the actual problem is that over the past 50 years, Republicans have set up this system where, you know, gradually moved us more and more into the system where they have tax cuts for the rich, where there's, you know, no unions, union penetration has gone way, way down over the past decades. You know, the whole right, when I lived in DC, just outside of DC, there was the right to life, or the right to work building. National right to work was like we drove past it on the way to the doctor or something, like all the time. Like huge infrastructure is spent to make these rules happen. And, you know, over the past 5 decades, we've got this study now from Catherine Ann Edwards and her co-authors at the Rand Institute that comes out to, you know, it was when we made the ad that we made in 2024, it was 50 trillion. Now they've updated the study. It's $79 trillion over the past few decades that they've taken from the rest of us. That would come out to $1,800 a month. Is that the only problem in America right now? No. But like, everybody having an extra $1,800 a month would make a big difference in all the other problems, right? So it's definitely a huge problem. That's not the only thing. I think there's a thing about the ethos that sort of goes with this that's like also missing, and there's a sense of common good, and there's empathy stuff that has gone wrong, and like it's just, but all of this, so many of these problems I think are exacerbated by this market fundamentalism, predatory capitalism system that we have. And where this sort of gets complicated, I think, is like, for the friend who sent this to me, and for a lot of my friends, really, is like, nobody really wants to like pick a side, right? Nobody wants to say, I'm against these people. Nobody wants to be angry partially because of this narrative around polarization, and partially just because of like who they are and how they think about the world. Like, there's like, you don't want to, it feels like there's so much fighting that there's such a strong temptation to like try to stay above that, to try to stay, to not get dirty with that, right? But there's an adherence to principle that at some point I think has to kick in. And this is where I don't really know how to explain it, right? Like, there's a higher good and a higher self that you have to get involved at some point, right? If something gets so egregious and so bad. And I think we're all at this point now, right? It's like even like 10 years ago, people were less at this point. I started getting involved, 20 years ago now, and more than that. And I could kind of see where things were going, and there were injustices that bothered me. Now the injustices are so much that, like, I think this tension has become so much more for people. And I don't quite know how to make the case that this is what you're doing, except to say that, like, if it helps, it's not necessarily that there's bad guys that are doing this, right? Like, we talk a lot about, like, even in narrative stuff, like, about how, like, there has to be a bad guy because that's how our brains sort of process narrative and process stories. But I think for some of us, at least, and for some people, and for like a lot of people who are like thinking about getting involved, thinking how to get involved, and have barriers to that, you don't have to think about it necessarily as like Jeff Bezos is the bad guy, or Leonard Leo, the guy who runs the Federalist Society, is a bad guy because he's been running this Federalist Society that led to the Supreme Court being the way that it is now, and so much of the problems we have in the judicial, or any of the architects of the conservative movement, the Koch brothers, right? You don't have to necessarily think of them as bad people or evil, or and this is where it gets tough, because like what Trump is doing is evil. I mean, like, what's dragging people out of their houses is evil. Like, this is evil, right? Are the people who funded anti-immigrant work 10 years ago evil? Are my parents evil because they voted for Republicans for a long time until the Howard Dean tape that we showed them in 2003, right? It's just this system, right? And it's not that the people are people are making decisions because of because they make reasons, because based on the input and based on their thinking, and it's just like what people do. There was a great Sherry Hoover book. She had a great line that was like, "There's no bad people, and there's no bad things that happen to good people. There's just people and things, right?" And these people have made decisions, and like what we've got now is a system that I think has become evil, right? So if we think, just rather than like personalizing this and saying Jeff Bezos is a bad person, he's the evil, and like Graham Plattner now is doing this a little bit. He's like the enemy is the oligarchy, right? And maybe not enemy, right? But this is our system in this country that we've built. We've built a system. We've made choices through our democracy that has led to a system that concentrates wealth. We can make other choices. We do not have to do that. And it doesn't have to be personalized. It doesn't have to be, I try to think so hard of my political opponents as my opponents. I try to learn from them. I sit on the yoga mat and I try to learn from them. Like, I try to be grateful for them. They're good at politics, right? Like, they're inspiring. I'm inspired by what Turning Point USA is doing with their contributors program. I think about it a lot. I watch their videos and I'm like, this is good communication. They're very clear, right? But it's a system that we all have control over. This is part of the democracy. So you're not necessarily fighting, but you have to engage in some way about like what's actually going on, and like just saying, okay, I'm above all this. The fighting needs to end. Like, that won't fix the problem, right? There's more that needs to happen. There's an engagement with what's actually going on, that there are people who will continue to do the things that they do until someone makes them change. And that is what's required in this moment. I hope that helps. That was definitely a long rant, but it's something I've been thinking about. Definitely curious what people think, and we'll put this up and see what people think. And thank you so much. I always want to remind everyone, please listen to our podcast, Turning the Way Forward. This is the kind of thing that we want to cover on there. I don't know if there's someone who out there who wants to hear who could talk about this on the longer show. I think it would be a good topic. Yeah, thanks so much, and yeah, we'll talk soon.